Okay, hello everybody. My name is Lenka Buštíková. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies. The center is a multidisciplinary hub for the study of Europe and European languages. Thank you for joining us for a talk today. The talk is co-sponsored by the Department of Political Science, and I want to thank staff at the Center for European Studies for putting this together. It's always a lot of work. A few housekeeping issues. Please sign in. Also, please fill out an evaluation. We will most likely take pictures. If you have an issue with that, talk to me right away. And obviously the talk will be recorded, but it's, it's HIlary's challenge. It's my utmost pleasure to introduce Professor HIlary Appel, a distinguished scholar and a wonderful colleague. We have crossed paths in similar academic circles for some time, and it's a true delight to welcome you, HIlary, today. HIlary is the Podlich Family Professor of Government and George Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. She also serves as the director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies. She has published numerous books and articles on the politics of economic reform and the foreign policy of Russia and Eastern Europe. Her books include Tax Politics in Eastern Europe, a page turner, New Capital. Sorry, I wouldn't help it. New Capitalist Order, Privatization and Ideology in Russia and Eastern Europe. And recently she co-wrote a book with Mitch Orenstein, From Triumph to Crisis, Neoliberal Economic Reform in Post-Communist Countries. The book won the Laura Shannon Silver Medal Prize for Best Book in European Studies. I read the book, it's fantastic. It is a page turner, actually. HIlary's articles have appeared in many journals. She also received many national fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, American Council of Learned Societies, Fulbright, National Council for Eurasian and East European Research, and the Woodrow Wilson Center. Today, Professor Appel will talk on populism and the durability of the liberal order in Eastern Europe, EU and NATO Enlargement Reconsidered. In her talk today, she will pose a question whether the recent rise of populist leaders in Eastern Europe should be understood as a part of a broader global democratic recession, or is it a consequence of region-specific paths of joining the liberal order, namely strict EU membership conditionality, loss of policymaking autonomy in the 1990s, and the creation of dependent market economies. This morning, or just recently, I asked HIlary, what's the answer? And she said, wait for the talk. So I am hooked up to find out, and please join me in welcoming Professor Appel. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much to everybody here. Tax politics happen to be more interesting than you would think, but you did not invite me here to speak about tax politics, so I will not take the risk. I will talk about this question of the rise of populism and democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe, especially Central Europe, and try to understand what are some of the origins of that. So, there's been a lot of interest in, I would say, that region, in part because this rise of populism is essentially occurring in some of the states that were truly the front runners of democratization, liberalization after the collapse of communism, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. These were the front runners for joining the WTO, the Council of Europe, NATO, EU, and yet these are also the front runners in the decline of democracy and this fear of backsliding. So it's been an interesting set of countries to look at. At the same time, the invasion in Ukraine is sort of an exogenous shock to this whole story and this whole question in terms of appreciation in this part of the world for multilateralism, for being part of international organizations that are there to either promote prosperity, democracy, or security. So it's a region that's gotten some attention as of late. But the particular question I'm asking is thinking about this decade of the 1990s and to try to unpack whether or not the way these countries joined these multilateral bodies, the kind of membership accession process that happened in Eastern Europe, is partly to blame for the democratic decline and the backlash against the EU that has occurred a couple of decades later. So is it something about the way in which they joined the EU? Or, as was brought up, the idea that they become these dependent market economies, or that they lost so much policy autonomy in this process that's somewhat or even significantly responsible for the Euroscepticism, the backlash, the financial nationalism, the nativism, or whatever particular aspect of this process that that interests you. Like, how much of this is related to what happened in the 1990s? You know, did multilateralism and key bodies contribute to the liberal transformation in Eastern Europe? Are they, in fact, credited, or should they be credited with the rise of liberal polities and economies? Or did the process of accession itself lead to a populist backlash and Euroscepticism later? Now, I have to confess, there's a reason why I'm asking this question in this time frame. It's because it's part of a project. And this is a book that's coming out in the end of the year, pretty soon. And what it was a project by Peter Trubowitz and John Eikenberry, who were very interested in looking in the decade of the 1990s. And for those political scientists in the room who've read some of this work by John Eikenberry, you know he was really interested in looking at the decade after the Second World War and the Bretton Woods institutions, and how this set the course for the liberal order in the West. So that decade was really important for institution building, and created a certain set of practices in Europe, in the US, and in other countries, allied and partners of these countries, to follow a liberal course in part of the world, right? So the question is, that decade following the collapse of communism, was that a lost decade? Was it a decade in which important sort of dynamics were put into place that would then be either positively or negatively responsible for the kinds of political systems that evolved there? And this project is a project where each chapter is another part of the world. So they reached out to me to talk about this for Eastern Europe. Someone else, Miles Kaler, has the chapter on East Asia. Someone has a Latin American chapter. Michael Cox has a Who Lost Russia, which I think is kind of the chapter I might have thought I wanted to write, because I thought I would have a lot to say about this. And what's interesting from my experience of being part of this project was that I think I was the only positive person in the whole room in the conferences, the multiple conferences where we put this project together. It was interesting because it forced us to think about it very much in terms of a global phenomenon, that there were a lot of countries undergoing similar dynamics, similar democratic backslides. But at the same time, academics like to be critical thinkers, critical of policies, all sorts of criticism. Whereas I was actually really quite positive in terms of the impact of inclusion of this part of the world in NATO, in the EU, for creating a trajectory of liberalism. So to kind of give away, foreshadow a little bit the argument, sure, there are linkages you can find. I do think that there were aspects of the way accession was carried out, primarily in the EU, that did contribute to some of the Euroscepticism that followed later. Certain ways in which the Washington Consensus policies created economic nationalism in some of these countries as well. There's certainly a lot of economic pain associated with certain policy choices that were made, and none of that can be denied. But ultimately, I think that the answer lies not so much in the 1990s and the choices made to incorporate these countries into the EU and NATO that would be much more significant for the dynamics that are so worrying today of populist leaders and democratic backsliding in Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, the main cases, especially Poland and Hungary, the primary cases of this chapter on Eastern Europe. And then the other thing I want to just give you a sense of what I'm doing in the talk is I do want to also bring in how the war in Ukraine factors into these questions as an exogenous shock that in a sense, could have altered some of the attitudes toward multilateralism, subsequently. So these are the kinds of things I want to make the case, is that the EU and NATO accession contributed positively and significantly to liberalization, to creating a liberal order, both politically, economically. Joining the EU helped countries undertake many difficult reforms and change the course of East European politics. And I think the Slovak case is one of the most extant examples, one of the most important examples of a real directional shift. But it's not only in Slovakia where we see choices that were made to pursue a more liberal political and economic system. But what didn't happen was the kind of lock-in effect that I think some scholars like Moravchik had hoped for, or I think a lot of us hoped for, the idea that you would constrain future leaders by virtue of the choices made by leaders in the 1990s. I think they felt that, oh, now we're part of the EU, now we're part of NATO, now we can't do certain things. Well, it turns out they could, right? It turns out that the lock-in effects really did not happen. And I think you can also say that the power of the EU for post-accession countries was clearly much weaker than maybe anticipated. Didn't take much to circumvent the kinds of penalties the EU could impose on those countries. All right, so this is why I'm looking at this decade, although I will go into some of the subsequent years where we start to see how these leaders, these populist leaders, were able to be so impactful and so successful electorally, despite these constraints that should have maybe prevented that from happening to the extent it has. So let me talk a little bit about EU membership. For some people in the room, it's so familiar, and for others, maybe it's less familiar. But what you need to understand about it was that it was incredibly intrusive. It was imposed from without. The logic was that if you want to join the EU, if you want to join that club, well, you have to accept the rules of the club. So there was something called accession negotiations, but there was nothing negotiated, right? This was an import of 80,000 pages of laws from the European Union that had to be harmonized with the domestic laws of those countries. So for the students in the room who may not have followed this as carefully, it was a very highly restrictive, rigid process. And some would even describe it as a coercive process, because if you wanted to join the club, which meant access to markets, access to capital, it meant really important security opportunities as well. You had to undertake a very difficult process of reforming, 31 different chapters, they were called, of your policies. So in other words, you had to change your taxes. So you say taxes, not tiring at all, because you found out that the European Union, because in this book I was really looking at external influences on tax policy. The EU decided the most minute things about your tax policy. So if you had rules for decades that you could have your spirits untaxed, that you could produce your own slivovice, or you could produce your own brandy, that you would not have any rules about this. Well, the EU said, no, this is exactly how you have to produce it, and this is how we're going to tax it, and we're going to use excise taxes. And these countries, it sounds like a small thing, but they had to negotiate transitional periods. But ultimately, they had to adopt the laws of taxation across so many different areas. I mean, it could be everything from children's clothes to diapers to baby formula, things that were politically sensitive. Either elites or, popular opinion had no ability, no influence over what was adopted in tax policy. And that was just one of 31 chapters. That's the one that I did my deep dive into, those negotiations. And again, it was really difficult for these countries to have to swallow so much legislation, so many rules without any variation. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't get transitional periods, but ultimately they had to, at the very least, adopt the new laws. And most importantly, they had to put into practice to the best of their abilities, or at least credibly put into practice, these new laws and rules over so many policy areas. And in a sense, it was a moment where they had to give up the policy autonomy that they had only recently gained from so many years of the lack of policy autonomy under the Soviet system, right? In Eastern Europe, where they didn't have full autonomy. So finally, they become autonomous countries, and yet, the legislature is not at all able to pass laws on something as basic as taxing and spending, which is sort of the heart of domestic politics, right? So it's a very interesting thing to study in detail, but you have to realize that, of course, it would be natural then to expect a backlash against the loss of control over your own domestic systems. And it does certainly find its way into the rhetoric of populist leaders later, right? They very much point to the loss of control to Brussels over a lot of domestic decision-making. Also, you have to recognize that the result of basically, how would I put this, of courting foreign investment created an economic system in a lot of the East European countries, beyond even Central Europe, for what's called dependent market economies, that so much of their financial sectors or their industrial sectors are owned by, business interests outside the country. And so again, these are consequences of the way in which the 1990s accession processes were carried out. Because if you didn't privatize your steel and coal industry, you just weren't going to join in 2004. And this was a really big deal for both the Czech Republic and I want to say Slovakia as well. No, Czech Republic and Poland. They were basically said, you don't close the competition chapter, then you're not in the first round of accession. And they considered that to be so problematic that they sold it to a single investor in a non-competitive bid just to make sure they could move ahead with the first round of accession. So if you go into the meat of how accession was carried out, it is a pretty plausible idea that, in fact, the 1990s were extremely important for creating a backlash afterwards. The one thing you do need to remember, however, is that in the period where the loss of autonomy, policymaking autonomy was greatest, was actually when enthusiasm, popular opinion, support for the EU was at its highest. There was a lot of recognition that the trade-offs of loss of policy autonomy in favor of being part of these organizations were trade-offs that the population was willing to make. And so when Slovakia in particular was a country that, due to its inability to implement certain democratic practices and norms under Vladimir Mečiar, suggested that it was going to prevent it from joining both NATO and the EU, then, there's a lot of work showing that Mečiar was just voted out of office for a government that was very wide in terms of the political spectrum, but made sure that they could join the European Union in, as quickly in the first round as possible. They weren't there in time for NATO, but it was delayed and they were in the second round. But are there real linkages is what the paper tried, the chapter, it's already coming out soon, but the chapter is trying to ask, are there still linkages despite the fact that there's so much popular support and willingness to absorb the trade-offs, the costs of membership, given the current backsliding, democratic backsliding, and the rise of populism? Well, let me say a little bit about, should I move this? Well, a little bit about how this starts to show up. It doesn't wait until the Eurosceptic rhetoric doesn't wait until Viktor Orban, for example, that we're all really familiar with, right? It actually starts earlier in the Czech case by Václav Klaus, who was one of the first Eurosceptics. And at the time, I don't think anyone thought he was so significant. I mean, I remember my own feelings about it because he's someone I followed very carefully for his work on privatization in the Czech case. So I remember when he started doing all this anti-EU stuff and then later anti-environmental stuff, I thought, well, the man's lost his mind. Like, I kind of felt like, everyone around him wants to join the EU. He just has this somehow this idea that this kind of anti-EU rhetoric was going to be effective, but in fact, he was not an outlier. He was a harbinger for what was going to come, because he uses this language of loss of autonomy and that the EU is imposing everything from without pretty early on. He says, I don't want the Czech Republic to be like a sugar cube in a teacup. And it's like the meaning of being Czech just dissolving into the EU. And it's all of this language about losing what it means to be Czech, and it comes in as early as 1998. But it's pretty clear that the language he uses then is repeated by Viktor Orban as early as, let's say, at this point, 2011 is when you start to hear it. But it's the same kind of language. We didn't let Vienna dictate us in 1848. We didn't let Moscow tell us what to do, and we're certainly not going to let Brussels dictate our policies. Well, in fact, they let Brussels dictate quite a few policies in the case of Hungary. And so that backlash when he came to power was to try to, pull back control over, for example, the banking sector, the financial sector, which was foreign owned. And he wanted this to be a big goal, that when he became prime minister again, he would make sure it was majority owned by Hungarians. And in fact, that was achieved. But the kind of Eurosceptic language of Orban or Kaczynski was not limited to just anti-EU language. In fact, it does go beyond that. And it really was a lot of actions that were essentially attacking the democratic norms that they were required to show evidence of embracing when they joined the EU. So what do I mean by that? They, in order to join the EU, but also to join NATO, they had to prove themselves to be democratic countries. And it's even true for NATO, which obviously was, making sure they had civil military relations, but also certain spending floors or certain, criteria for intelligence sharing. They had all these military criteria, but they also had human rights, democratic politics, and market reforms as part of the membership criteria. So, Orban had to agree to all these things. Not Orban, Hungary had to agree to all these things. And then when Orban comes to power, says, we don't have to be liberal. Why do we have to be liberal? You can be illiberal and still be part of the EU. And there's this famous speech where he makes, that's often quoted, that he says, I think we can be illiberal and in the EU. Whereas the EU said, no, you can't join the EU unless you are liberal. But we also see that there's real democratic decline. And I'm sure it's familiar to many of you that we see limitations on the media, we see constraints on the judiciary, we see gerrymandering in ways that intends to ensure that he remains in power, and that's been very successful. We've seen crackdowns on human rights organizations, universities, so we have seen real decline. And this what triggers the Article 7 proceedings for Hungary and also Poland. By 2018, both countries have this Article 7 proceedings that the EU says you have violated our norms so severely that we need to undertake these particular procedures to really investigate whether we need to penalize you or whether maybe even you shouldn't be part of the EU. So it was these two countries, Poland and Hungary, are singled out for this reason. So they are not only using the rhetorical device of Euroscepticism and sort of anti-democratic, practices. They're not just using the rhetoric, they're undergoing these kinds of practices that trigger these Article 7 proceedings. And it also leads to efforts to impose fines. But interestingly, those fines were very difficult to actually carry out for that long. Nonetheless, those kinds of approaches, very strong populism and Euroscepticism, turn out to be successful electorally. And these are just some sense for you to see the electoral success of Hungary, of Poland, of these populist parties. But I also think this is useful just for a moment for you to see this in context over time. So there are other countries that are also quite have quite successful populist parties in power. but they're strong in Hungary and Poland. All right. So let's see if we can talk a little bit about explaining the success of Euroscepticism and populist parties electorally, right? How do we get to this point where they're in power? They prove themselves to be populist law and justice party, Fidesz. In these two cases, why is this happening? So how much of this is really a case of these countries have, from a popular level, moved away from these norms? In other words, is the population so resentful of the kinds of economic hardships that they undergo in the 1990s in the transformation from communism to capitalism, that they are then really supporting populism and they support more autocratic leaders? So what I argue in this chapter is that essentially the kinds of both strategies for elections as well as popular sentiment for, more autocratic politics really starts to decline in the mid-2000s. It certainly is pretty irrelevant for, any kinds of language about the EU or democracy. Those kinds of, the public opinion in the 1990s is still very supportive of joining the EU, joining NATO, and all of this. When do you start to see the decline? You see it in the mid-2000s. So that's one thing that I think is quite important. It really spikes around the time of Europe's financial crises, following the global financial crisis in 2008, which is extended in Europe for another anywhere from, you could say, 2 to 7 years, depending on the country. In fact, Hungary receives a very significant bailout as a result of its own financial crisis. So Hungary has some economic pain in the mid-2000s, 2010s, in the teens, that is really unrelated to the pain of transition of the early 1990s. It seems quite unrelated to the loss of policy autonomy in the 1990s, and is very much instead a story that's well beyond Hungary or Poland, having to do with the global financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, the European financial crises in the 2000 teens, let's put it that way, the early 2010 to as late as 2015. That's when you start to see a really downward spiral in public opinion polls about the EU, about democracy, or attitudes that are quite critical of liberal norms. So a lot of hostility toward immigrants, for example, starts really much later than any of these crises. It starts around 2012. Another really important thing to look at in terms of what's causing the rise of populism in Eastern Europe, well beyond the challenges of the 1990s for ordinary people as they transition from one kind of system to another, has to do with the weakening of mainstream parties. And in this case, this is, you're saying, is it global? Is it local? Well, locally, there's some things happening that matter. For example, the left in both Poland and Hungary are significantly discredited for reasons that are actually quite localized, quite parochial. So in Hungary, the Social Democrats have been, the financial crisis happens on its watch, but it's also falsifying data, economic data. It's thoroughly discredited, and the center left is hollowed out in a way that does open up a space for populist parties. For example, more traditional parties in the center are not competing well against more populist parties. But the reality is that center parties around the world are also doing a very bad job of responding to the hardships or the challenges that ordinary people are facing in the economy. And it's not being taken seriously by centrist parties, pro-EU parties. And so in some ways, there are local reasons why the left is discredited. Center left is discredited in Hungary, right? The bailout, the fraudulent behavior of the Social Democrats. But it's also a phenomenon we see very broadly, where centrist parties are not responding to the economic concerns of their populations. And I think also that to explain the electoral success of these populist parties, you do have to look at some of the individual stories about institutional changes, especially Hungary once again, right? The idea that the gerrymandering, the changing of the electoral rules, the proportional representation system is altered in ways that favor the parties and locks in their ability to stay in power. And yet, all of this still needs to be understood within the global context. I think if we're going to try to have an idea about what is causing the rise of populism in Europe, starting in the 2000 teens, you have to recognize this is part of a wave of populism and strongman leadership that is becoming more and more popular around the world. Well, why would that matter? I think what's important to recognize is that leaders who violate repeatedly liberal norms, who engage in kind of economic nationalism and these very vicious taxes to try to force out foreigners and all sorts of things that's happening in this part of the world, what happens is it creates a demonstration effect where strongman leadership is not penalized. There are no real consequences for this kind of behavior in the 2000 teens in the way that there really was in the 1990s. So you can see that it doesn't result in a loss of investors. It doesn't result in a delay of membership in institutions. It doesn't block their access to markets. It doesn't result in anything that might deter this behavior in the way that it did in the 1990s. In the 1990s, there was such a different zeitgeist, right? The idea is that liberal norms were ascendant, and if you didn't prove yourself to seem sufficiently democratic or free market in your orientation, you were discredited. And there was a different sense that if you were left outside of these institutions who required this embrace of liberal norms, you were going to suffer, you were going to pay for that decision. But in the 2000 teens, absolutely that's not the case. You can see that leaders with impunity continue to violate liberal norms without any real institutional consequence. Like the EU is unable to do anything with a little bit of coordination. The EU those kinds of constraints are circumvented to the point that the EU has realized that the Article 7 proceedings have done nothing to change behavior. Once these countries are full members, there's no real power to change behavior. So the 1990s had a lot happening that promoted liberal norms in ways that's not true later. And this zeitgeist was not only different, but the consequences seem to have evaporated for breaking with these liberal norms that were expected if you wanted to join the EU, NATO, and so on. Now, one thing that I would say that is questioning in terms of how do we read this region from other regions? So I'm a comparativist, and the temptation is always to see something very deeply as a consequence of the internal dynamics. And, all of us in this field feel very strongly about the importance of local knowledge and deep understanding of these systems. And, all of us have spent a lot of time in the region and feel that, we really do need to understand the domestic origins of these phenomena. But at the same time, how can we ignore the fact that this is happening in country after country after country, in region after region after region? And I think, that makes me feel like, well, is it something about the values of these people, or is there a global phenomenon that is also really significant in understanding the simultaneity of this kind of challenge and this kind of behavior? Well, so then you start to look at, well, what are the values of Poles and Czechs and Hungarians? Why are they voting in these autocratic leaders? Do they not care about democracy? Do they not care? Do they dislike the EU? Are they feeling kind of lingering resentments from what they experienced in the 1990s when they really had to suffer a lot and continue to suffer as a consequence of the introduction of free markets? Well, it turns out that the data that you can find, whether it's Eurobarometer, Pew, Gallup, show that despite this very surprisingly effective Eurosceptic rhetoric, it doesn't really manifest itself in the public opinion data. And certainly, Euroscepticism is not stronger in Eastern Europe polling data than it is in Western European polling data. So maybe, it's a whipping boy for all countries, the European Union, but the reality is, as much as we see the success of these anti-EU parties, the public opinion data are actually more pro-EU in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. So it really is a bit interesting that, we have so much worry about Eastern Europe when they continue to be rather EU, and you don't have any kind of Brexit-like calls to exit the European Union, despite all the times people are complaining about the EU. There's no one said we need to withdraw from this. We need to secede from the EU or NATO, for goodness sakes, right? That's just not part of the popular opinion that's out there. In fact, I like Ivan Krastev's point. East Europeans are among the most pro-EU publics on the continent, yet they vote for some of the most Eurosceptic governments. These governments in turn use Brussels as a rhetorical punching bag while benefiting from its financial largesse. So again, you don't see it transforming into a movement to pull out of the European Union. You don't see it as a real desire to rely on any kind of national autonomy for their own security. It's just not at all how people are seeing it. In fact, if anything, the data show that there's a desire for greater multilateralism in the area of security, NATO, but also from the EU itself to have some kind of common European defense. It's very high, the numbers. It's about 80% in these countries, 8 out of 10, East Europeans wanting to have some common European defense. So it's not moving in the other direction. So when I say, that the European, that Poland and Hungary, these two Eurosceptic countries that for a lot of years had a lot of success for Eurosceptic politicians. I've talked a lot about Hungary, but in Poland, despite the return of Tusk and the Law and Justice being pushed out until the presidential elections, nonetheless, there's a lot of support for the EU consistently in the Polish population. So if you look at, this one's set up as Hungary versus Poles, this Pew research in 2022, but actually they're both really quite positive and well beyond what you can see in some other European countries in terms of Euroscepticism. So I don't think the East Europeans are more Eurosceptic, despite the fact that their politicians seem to get into office more successfully than we're seeing in other European countries. So if you want, here's some relative data. So yeah, you can say the EU and Poland, oh, look, they're so Eurosceptic, they're so sort of anti-democratic, but in fact, their views of the EU, this one is also Pew. These are some early numbers. You can see they're higher than a lot of their West European counterparts. This is from 2022, having a positive view of the EU. This is before the invasion of Ukraine, when these polls were actually taken, even though it's published in 2022. Poland, 89%, Hungary, 69%. All right, Germany is very high. But, they're not falling, so out of range. If anything, they're higher than the EU average in 2022. Interestingly, there's been some decline. I can show you some data that's been published by Pew showing that actually it may have peaked around 2022. It's gone down in many countries. Positive views on the EU. Where's Poland? Poland has fallen a bit. Hungary has fallen a bit. But those numbers are not out of line, even if these countries are continually voting for leaders who then come into office with extreme anti-liberal rhetoric, significant anti-liberal practices, and Eurosceptic rhetoric as well. All right, let me say something about the war in Ukraine. So when this project began, it was shortly after the full-scale invasion in February 24th, 2022. And I think a lot of people were expecting that the war in Ukraine would create a renewed appreciation for multilateralism. So maybe, you can talk a good line about how much you don't want to be in the EU and how much you don't like being part of NATO or anything like that. But in reality, when you feel the threat of, a Russian invasion, you might change your mind, or you might tamp down in that rhetoric. And in fact, it happened very briefly. Even Orban called Zelensky and said, "What can we do to help you?" But it did not last long at all. I would say it didn't last weeks, it lasted days. Pretty quickly, the pro-Russian position of Orban was reemerging as part of his campaign. He was reelected just 6 weeks later on a campaign of, good ties with Russia is good for our own peace and energy security. It did not change the thinking or the language of Orban at all. In fact, he had very important investments in Hungary from Russia in pharmaceuticals, in telecommunications, in transportation that he was not willing to jeopardize, and also felt that their reliance on Russian energy was too great to participate in EU level limitations on the import of Russian hydrocarbons. So it did not lead to a revival of liberal norms, values, or more importantly, an appreciation of multilateralism in Hungary. If anything, the leadership continued along this path of sort of exploiting this line to try to get their point across. Slovakia also had elections in 2023 that were important for the return of Robert Fico in terms of his more populist position and more pro-Russian position. And there was some sense that this would be very significant because Poland had shifted back to, pushing out the Law and Justice Party and pushing back to a more pro-EU position. And yet, the ability of Hungary to still collaborate, to coordinate a little bit with another country to avoid any kind of repercussions for its behavior was made possible. At least that was the expectation with the re-election of Smer in Slovakia. But it turns out that that was a little bit less of a partner as was initially anticipated. We see that populist parties are on the rise, and quite recently so in the Czech case. For example, they just had elections, and you're choosing between one populist party and an even more populist party. So we don't really see that the trends in the Czech case are particularly helpful either in moving away from either more Eurosceptic politics. In fact, the war in Ukraine has created some of the tensions and some of the reasons for elite turnover, because there's a lot of resentment that has been an effective campaign strategy on the war, the cost of the war that the Czechs have assumed, because it's been costly for these countries to absorb both refugees, but also to help fund the military campaign. So if anything, we don't see that the kinds of worrying trends of populism in Eastern Europe are going away. We do see that the public opinion are not out of line with what we see in Western Europe. So the rise of populism is strong in Western Europe, and you can add other countries into the story if you wanted to in terms of the rise of populism. But nonetheless, we definitely see that the importance of staying in these institutions has been sustained, right? There isn't a strong movement to leave the EU, but there's plenty of campaign rhetoric to reject the EU. So NATO enlargement, EU accession, in my chapter, in my article, are positive cases of promoting liberalism in the region. And a lot of the populism and a lot of the EU backlash, I instead argue is related to what happens not just in Eastern Europe, but it happens later and it emerges around the time of the financial crises, and also it emerges around sort of a spike in migration in Europe as well. So it's less about the very intrusive membership negotiations of the 1990s. NATO is also has a section in the paper. I haven't said too much about it, but there really has never been an anti-NATO backlash. Certainly, even in any anti-EU country right now, you don't see any calls to pull out of NATO or anything like that. It just doesn't exist right now, obviously. But also, you know, the process of NATO accession did not, maybe let's put it this way, it was not as closely monitored. It wasn't as invasive. It didn't have as many laws that had to be adopted. So the process, you would not even expect it to have been triggering of this kind of reaction in the same way EU accession did. But nonetheless, given the conditions right now of war in Europe, it's just not the reason for the crisis. That said, it could have been better handled, right? There's no reason that the accession negotiations had to be as fast as they were, that you had to have everything closed by 2004, that somehow or another the cost of transition needed to be as painful as they were. You could have had less rejection of social safety nets, you know, slower privatization. A lot of things that were difficult for people did not have to happen for the outcomes to have been realized. So more attention to the suffering of a lot of groups would have probably resulted in a better, if not equivalent, result in getting these countries to be full members of these multilateral organizations. So I would say that it could have been better, but that I consider that the opportunity to have been fully included as full members, the East European former communist countries, into these organizations with veto rights and equal power in, nominally certainly, in these organizations was visionary and important and transformed these countries. And we don't know if they had not had the prospect of EU membership or the NATO alliance as something that created an incentive for creating, you know, liberal polities, how things would have looked. I mean, we can maybe think about what happened for those countries that did not have a credible prospect of joining the EU and what that meant. You know, if we look at Moldova, if you look at Serbia, if you look at Belarus, if you look at Russia for that matter, like if you didn't have some of these incentives, would that have resulted in very different trajectories for Eastern Europe? We don't know that, but there's some suggestion that the incentives that came along with it, the investment opportunities, the access to markets, and the security guarantees mattered for the trade-offs required to undertake some pretty difficult liberal reforms. So EU accession was certainly too fast, too rigid, excessive scrutiny, more social safety nets were needed. I think NATO enlargement could have paid more attention to how this would be interpreted by Russia later. Things could have, you know, been even more visionary, but nonetheless, I think it was positively associated with liberalization in this region. And I credit the European elites who understood that full membership was not only possible, but necessary to have the impact they were hoping to have. I think we could have had more appreciation for the damaging effects that people experienced due to the introduction of free markets. And I sort of have to fault myself in this because I wrote a lot on, you know, transforming communist economies to capitalist economies and just sort of felt like, well, capitalism is better for wealth creation. I had experienced what it was like to live in the Soviet Union in the Gorbachev era at the end, but it was pretty bad. I mean, it was a pretty painful time to live through those non-functioning economies, these shortage economies, these very difficult economic conditions. So I think I may have underappreciated just how painful this experience was in the things I wrote about what was achieved in, you know, creating the conditions that made you eligible for these institutions. But nonetheless, ultimately, you know, thinking that joining the EU, joining NATO were net positive for these countries. But at the same time, I would just conclude with saying that even if it promoted liberal change in the 90s, and therefore we shouldn't think about the 1990s as an era of mistaken foreign policies, it did not create the kind of lock-in effects that would inoculate these countries from the kinds of forces, the kinds of dynamics that have led to the rise of autocratic leaders and populists in existing member states. So I'm going to end it there and just answer any questions you may have, but let's leave it at that. The book comes out 6 weeks from now, so it'll be published soon. All right, so thanks.